Hello guys, welcome back to another episode of The Bear Tech. Today we're going to be installing Ubuntu 22.04 as a virtual machine in Unraid. Today we're going to be installing Ubuntu Server 22.04, which is the latest and greatest long-term support or LTS version of Ubuntu Server onto our Unraid NAS. But don't worry, however, if your hypervisor of choice is VMware, Hyper-V, Proxmox, that's fine. Most of these steps in this video will also accommodate your requirements. So simply skip ahead using the timecodes in the video description below. First of all, what we need to do is we need to head over to ubuntu.com where we'll download the ISO image. We'll check a few settings inside Unraid. We'll upload the ISO image to our Unraid server, and then we'll proceed to configure our virtual machine using the Unraid web GUI. Once that's done, we'll then start on the virtual machine, install the operating system, set a static IP address for our network, and then at the end of the video, we'll go through some tips and tricks as to what I personally like to do after installing a Ubuntu server. So anyway, without further ado, let's jump in. Right, okay, so first we want to head over to ubuntu.com, where you'll probably be presented with a screen like this. Simply click accept and visit the site. Next up, we're going to click the download button here, and we're going to choose Get Ubuntu Server. It's now pretty simple. We're just going to use the big green button here to download Ubuntu Server 22.04 LTS. So we'll give it a few seconds and the download should start. If it doesn't, obviously we can click this little download option here. So depending on the speed of your internet, this may take a few minutes. Okay, so let's jump across to the Unraid web GUI. Okay, so here we are back in Unraid. There's a few things we need to check first of all. So by default, Unraid has a folder called ISOs. ISO, or an ISO, is a term for a digital format of a compact disk. Most of the operating systems that you download today, and well, to be honest, since ever, have always come in the ISO format. So what we're going to do is we're going to check in Unraid to make sure that our ISOs directory is shared. If it isn't, we're going to share it, and so that we can then access it from our Windows machine and upload the ISO that we just downloaded containing the Ubuntu operating system. So back onto our Unraid system, we're going to click on Shares. And as you can see, I've got quite a few shares here, but the one we're particularly interested in is ISOs. So as you can see by the hyphens here, this directory is not actually shared to our network. So let's just go and configure that now. So to configure this, we want to click on ISOs, and scrolling down, we're going to check out the SMB security settings. So SMB stands for Server Message Block, which is the Windows technology for sharing files over the network. What we want to do is we want to come across and change this drop down to yes, and then choose private. Once done, we can click on apply, and then you'll notice that some additional options will populate below this section. So we're now going to give users access to the share. So I'm going to give myself access. So I'm going to say read and write, and I'm going to hit apply. Give it a few seconds, and then we're going to head back to shares, and then we should see ISOs is now shared. As you can see, the hyphen has now been replaced with private. Next up, we want to upload our ISO image to the server. So we're going to open up Windows File Explorer, and we're going to navigate to that share on our Unraid system. So going over to our downloads, we've got the Ubuntu 22.04 download. I'm going to copy that, so selecting it, and I'm going to hold Ctrl+C. Alternatively, you can right click here and choose copy. Next up, we want to click into this location bar here, and we want to navigate to it. So whilst my Unraid server uses the IP address 172.25.87.3, your network probably uses a more common IP range such as 192.168.0.1. So simply replace the IP address that I'm using here with your own. You should now be presented with a list of shared directories from your Unraid system. Simply locate and double click on the ISO directory. So now we're in that directory, we can now simply paste in that Ubuntu server ISO file. So here we're going to just right click and then choose paste. Fantastic, so that's now done. So we can now close Windows Explorer, and we can head back to our Unraid control panel. Next up, we want to head across to the virtual machines tab up here. As you can see, I've already got a couple of virtual machines on my Unraid system. You may or may not already have some virtual machines, but next up we want to click the Add VM button. And now we're going to choose the template. So we're going to click on this Ubuntu icon down here. which will then take us into the configuration of the virtual machine. So ultimately, you can configure the virtual machine however you want. You can give it as much resources as you have or available on your system. So whilst I don't need to give it that many resources, it will happily run with 1 GB of RAM or even 512 megabytes. But in this instance, I'll give it 2 GB of RAM. So let's first of all name the server. Personally, I like to have some kind of naming conventions for my servers on my LAN. I personally use the convention VSVR for a virtual server, or I use SVR for a physical server. It just makes things a lot easier. Then what I use generally is a hyphen to identify what the primary role of that server is. So for example, I've got a proxy server that's running on a Raspberry Pi here, which actually proxies traffic to enable me to host my own websites from home. In that instance, because it's a physical device, its hostname is svr-pxy for proxy, and I use the last 3 digits to denote what the actual octave of the IP address in that network range is. So for example, like I mentioned, I'm using the 172.25.87.3 for my Unraid server. My proxy server is 172.25.86.6. So the full hostname for that proxy server is svr-pxy006. Anyway, so I'm going to call this VSVR for virtual server hyphen resolve project server, and I'm going to give it the IP address of 125. So I'm going to call it 125. Next up, we're going to add a description. This gives a nice little label to the Unraid GUI when you're viewing the list of virtual machines. It just makes it a lot easier to identify what's running on that virtual machine and potentially how important that is. So anyway, I'm going to call it DaVinci Resolve Project Server. So if we wanted to set this virtual machine up as a quad-core virtual machine, we'd essentially have to choose 4 logical CPUs. So in this instance, I'm just going to choose CPUs 2 and 6. I'm going to choose 2 and 6, 3 and 7. And I'm actually going to deselect CPU 0 as that is used by Unraid. So we've now assigned 4 logical or virtual cores to our virtual machine. The next step is to allocate some RAM. So I'm going to give this virtual machine 2 GB of RAM. Obviously, it's entirely up to you how much RAM you want to give to your virtual machines. Obviously, just consider how much RAM your system has in total and how much your system is generally already using. We can do this by simply selecting the initial memory, 2048, and this will automatically populate the max memory. To be honest, most of the other settings in this configuration can pretty much remain the same. Ubuntu is not really that fussy about how the virtual machine is configured. So we've only really got a few more things we need to do. So we're now going to head over to the OS install ISO, and we're going to click in this blue text area. We're then going to get a list of ISOs that are in that shared ISO directory. So anyway, we're going to locate and click on our Ubuntu 2204 ISO image. One other thing we need to do is we need to specify the size of the virtual disk. So by default, Unraid will use your cache drive, if you have one, to store your virtual machine virtual disk files. So in this instance, I'm going to give this virtual machine 60 GB of RAM, so that's 60G. As you might have noticed, if we remove that, it gives you the examples. So if you want to just give it 10 megs, it'd be 10M. Alternatively, if you want to specify gigabytes or terabytes, it'd be G and T respectively. So in this instance, 60 gigabytes, I'm going to give it 60G. I'm going to leave the rest pretty much default, other than I'm going to change the keyboard layout to English United Kingdom. And that's it. Now all we need to do is hit create, give it a few seconds, and then we should be able to launch our new virtual machine and kick off the installation of Ubuntu. So at this point, if you are one of those users that are using Proxmox, Hyper-V, or VMware, this next section and the sections going forward in this video are going to be relevant to you. As you can see here, we've got the try or install Ubuntu server. Whilst we can wait for the timer down the bottom here to count down to 0, we can use the arrow keys to select the options from the installer and then just press enter. So here I'm going to just choose the default option, which is try or install Ubuntu server, and press enter on the keyboard to continue. Ubuntu is now booting up from our ISO image and will shortly be entered into the installer system. So here's the Ubuntu server installation wizard. So we can use the arrow, enter and tab keys here to navigate the installation wizard to get Ubuntu installed. So using the down arrow keys, I'm going to select English UK. Pressing enter will then be asked for our keyboard layout. So using the up arrow keys, I'm going to change the layout to English UK. So I'm going to press enter here. Using the up arrow keys, select English UK, and then go down to done and press enter. So here I'm just going to accept the default option, which is Ubuntu Server. This doesn't install a graphical user interface by default, so don't worry about that. It's just going to install some additional binaries and command line tools, which will make our lives easier going forwards. So anyway, on this screen, we're going to hit done. So now we're at the network configuration screen for Ubuntu. We've got two options, and by default, Ubuntu Server will use DHCP, which is essentially a way of devices on your network automatically obtaining an IP address from devices such as your ISP's broadband router. But obviously, as we're installing a server, it's best practice to set up a static IP address so that it's easy for clients to access the server and resources on your network without the IP address constantly changing. So here we're going to go and set up a static IP address. Again, using the arrow keys, we're going to head up to this first option here. So the name of the interface may be different for your machine. It's generally going to be ENP1S0 or ETH0. So hovering over the first section by using the arrow keys, simply press enter where we can then change the configuration for this network interface. So we're going to scroll down to edit IPv4 and press enter. Press enter to bring up the list where we're going to then use the arrow keys to go down to manual, and we're going to press enter. So now we have the options for the network interface settings. In this instance, I'm going to assume you're using a 192.168.0 network. So I'll show you what you would type in for that network, and then I'll just quickly make the changes for my specific requirements. So first of all, in subnet, we're going to change this to 192.168.0.0/24. So it's common for home networks to use the /24 address. It essentially gives you 255 usable addresses in your network. I can almost guarantee, unless you're running an advanced setup, and in which case you probably know more about this sort of stuff than what I do, then the /24 is what you'll want to use at the end of this IP address. Next up, pressing the down arrow, we can then enter our IP address of the server. This is the IP address that you'll be using to access this virtual machine. This isn't the IP address of your Unraid system, just the new virtual machine that's running on Unraid. So essentially your server will now go from having one IP address to two. The second IP address being a virtual IP address that will then pass through to the virtual machine. So here we'll use 192.168.0.2. Again, you'll need to change this IP address to whatever IP you want this virtual machine to have on your network. And again, going down to gateway, it's probably common if you're using consumer grade routers that it's going to be the same IP address. And this IP address is generally going to be 1 or 254 in your network. So I'm just going to assume in this instance and use in this example that your router is 192.168.0.1. For name servers, again, this is generally going to be the IP address of your router. So 192.168.0.1. So for search domains, if you've got an internal domain that you're using, like home.local, or if you've got a more advanced setup, this could be yourstudio.com. But for now, this really doesn't affect us, so we can actually leave this as is, and we can just go down to save and continue. So now, as I mentioned, I've got more advanced setups. So I'm just going to go back, change up some of the IP addresses so that it matches my setup for my network. So when that's done, we're just going to hit save. Using the down arrow keys, we're going to go and select done and press enter. Next up, proxy address. I can almost guarantee you won't need this. Simply click done here. Again, we can accept the default and just hit done. So unless you've got a specific need and use case for this, simply accept the defaults by using the arrow keys and going down to done again. Press enter here. So at this point, the installer is now giving us an overview as to how it's going to partition our virtual disk. Again, we just go down and accept the defaults and click done. So at this point, Ubuntu is now going to ask us if we're happy to enter destructive mode, which is essentially going to format and set up the partition. Again, here, just use the down arrow keys. I'm going to select continue. Next up, we're asked for a user account. So by default, when we log into Ubuntu, we'll use this non-privileged account. We can then use sudo to gain elevated access to enable us to do all kinds of things, such as configure and install software. So consider the username and password that you want to use to log into your server, and then set it here. Next up, we've got the server's name. Whilst we've named the virtual machine inside Unraid, we haven't actually specified the virtual machine's operating system what it thinks its hostname is. So the actual hostname that we used on the Unraid system at the start of this video wasn't actually the hostname of the virtual machine, it's more just a label for us to clearly identify it later. So here we're going to enter the hostname for our server. So vsvr resolve project server 125. So now we've entered our name at the top, the server's name. We're now going to press tab and we're going to enter a username. And then next we're going to choose a password. Press tab again and then confirm it below. We're now going to press tab and then press enter to continue the installation. So at this point, the installation wizard is asking us if we want to install the OpenSSH server. We definitely want to choose this option to enable us to remotely access it from our Windows, Mac or Linux machines. So we're going to press the spacebar here to enable it, and then we're going to use the arrow keys on the keyboard to go down to done and then press enter. At this point, it's going to ask us if we want to install some additional components and packages. We don't need any at this point, so we're just going to press tab and then press enter to continue with the installation. So the installation is now started. This is going to take a few minutes. So at this point, the installer is now telling us, by indicating at the bottom, we get the option to reboot now. We're going to use the arrow keys again to go down, highlight reboot now, and then press enter. So our virtual machine is now restarting, and when it's fully restarted, we'll be able to log into it using the web terminal provided by Unraid. So don't worry, when you see this particular section, simply press enter. The virtual machine will now reboot, and after a few seconds, we'll be able to log into it and do some initial configuration. Okay, so whilst the screen looks kind of messy at the moment, don't worry, this is completely normal for the first boot. We can simply press enter here to bring up the login prompt, and we're going to log in with the username and password that we created during the installer. So in my case, my username is Bobby and my password will enter now. Pressing enter will log us into our Ubuntu server, and we can type clear here just to clear up the screen a little bit. So now the server is installed and we're logged in, let's go and make a few initial changes to the configuration just to harden it a little bit. I always recommend enabling the default firewall, and through the other tutorials in this mini-series that I'll be publishing on YouTube over the coming weeks, we will be adding and building upon our firewall rules to enable those additional services through the firewall. So as our user account is a non-privileged user, although it is a member of the sudo's group, which means we can execute root privileged commands, we do, however, need to prefix our commands that require elevated access with the word sudo, which stands for system user do. So here, let's type in sudo space UFW space status. UFW stands for the uncomplicated firewall, which is the default firewall that's installed with Ubuntu out of the box. At this point, we're going to press enter, and it's going to ask you for your password. Simply enter that here and press enter. As you can see, the UFW at the moment is currently inactive. We haven't enabled it, so our server is actually running without a firewall. But don't worry, we'll enable that now. So simply sudo and then UFW enable and press enter. As you can see, the firewall is now active. Let's now go and check the status and check what ports are open by default. So now, as we've already used the commands sudo UFW status, we can actually press the up arrow on the keyboard twice to bring up the previous commands. Simply pressing return here will now show us the status of the firewall. As we'll be accessing this virtual server remotely using SSH from other clients on the network, we'll need to enable the SSH port. But before we do that, we're actually going to go and change the port. So by default, the port used by SSH is TCP22. This is actually a very common port, and hackers will try to brute force access to systems using this port specifically. I always personally recommend to change the default SSH port on your servers. So let's now go and edit the configuration for the OpenSSH server and change the default SSH port. So from here, we're going to type in sudo nano space / edit SSH, and then we're going to type in sshd_config and press return. We're now going to scroll down and we're going to uncomment this line here. So by default, Linux configuration files, when they're using a default value and it's not enabled, they'll generally have it as a commented out line, but showing you what the default value would be. In this case, port 22 is the default value, even though the configuration is commented out. So I'm going to uncomment this line and I'm going to change the port to an alternative port. In this case, I'm going to choose 5234. So port 5234 is just a port I made up. Be aware, however, there are a limited number of TCP ports which you can configure for applications on your server. So if it needs to be, go and Google the range of ports that are available for you to use. I think it goes up to something like 63,000. But anyway, at this point, we're now done. So we're going to save the changes by pressing Control and O. That's also indicated down in the bottom left of this window where it says write out. So Control and O, it's going to ask us to confirm that, and we're just going to press Enter here. Now that's done, we can now exit out of Nano by pressing Control and X. Now we're back at our terminal prompt. Let's just clear up the screen by typing clear, and we're back to here. So whilst we've changed the configuration for OpenSSH server, that change hasn't actually taken effect just yet. We actually now need to go and apply it. And to apply it, we restart the Linux daemon. A Linux daemon, by the way, in case you're not from a Linux background, is actually just the same as a Windows service. It's a process that runs in the background of your Linux operating system. So we can do that now by typing in sudo service ssh restart. So now the SSH server is restarted. We should now be able to log into our Ubuntu server using an SSH client. Mac and Linux, you can use the built-in terminal that's provided with the operating system. So for now, I'm going to simply use the Microsoft terminal that comes with Windows. At the terminal, we can type in SSH space our username for our Linux server. So it's going to be Bobby in this case. And we're going to say @ and then we're going to specify the server's IP address. So remember, in my instance, this is 172.25.87.125. Your IP address, however, will be different depending on your network configuration. Next up, because we've changed the default port number, we actually need to specify a space at the end of this line and type the hyphen character P. So -P specifies a custom port. Then we're going to press space and we're going to type in that port number. So in this instance, the port number that I chose was 5234. Once that's done, just press enter and we should get a login prompt. So initially, when you first connect to a server using SSH from a client device, the client device will essentially verify and validate that host to make sure that someone hasn't swapped out the server and is then logging your passwords that you're using to access that device, which could then essentially leak that password and be used in various malicious ways by an attacker. So here we need to verify the fingerprint. Just to be honest, if you've just installed this on your local network, you can just verify it immediately. So here we're going to type yes and then press enter. It's now going to prompt us for the password. So again, we're now going to enter the password that we used during the installation of Ubuntu. So here, heading back, we're going to enter that password now and press enter. And congratulations, we're now logged into our Ubuntu server. So at this point, let's check for all available package updates for Ubuntu and apply those upgrades. Sudo apt update. And then we'll upgrade those by typing in sudo apt upgrade and press return. We'll now be prompted to confirm whether we want to install these new packages. At this point, we can press Y to accept and then press return. This will now go away and download and install all of the latest packages for our Ubuntu operating system. And now, since Ubuntu 22.04, the package manager now asks us if we want to restart certain services. In this case, we're just going to press the tab key and we're going to click OK. So guys, congratulations. At this point, we've now installed Ubuntu as a virtual machine on our Unraid system. We've changed the default SSH configuration to use a custom port number, and we've enabled the default firewall within Ubuntu. So guys, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was informative. I hope you learned a few things. I also have many other mini-series coming out shortly, such as self-hosted services and applications on your network. So if you're into Linux or find this kind of thing interesting, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and do check back soon. For now, however, I'll let you get on. So go play with your new Ubuntu virtual machine, and I'll see you in the next one.